New Day by V S Reid. Summary. Part 1. Rebellion and Ruin. The story opens with the voice of old John Campbell remembering himself as a boy of about 8, living in rural Jamaica. The year is 1865, a few decades after emancipation, yet life for formerly enslaved black people remains marked by plantation exploitation, harsh poverty, and deep injustice. Drought has made matters worse. Crops fail, hunger rises, and what should have been a time of relief after slavery has become another landscape of suffering. John grows up watching adults struggle to feed families, while local planners and officials seem indifferent to the everyday hardship. His younger eyes absorb tension without fully understanding that these conditions are pushing people toward revolt. John's family is respectable, mixed in ancestry, and slightly better off than many neighbors, yet they feel the same sense of dispossession. His father, Pa John Campbell, believes firmly in British law and loyalty to colonial authority. He insists that law is law and that justice will eventually be done if people stay patient. His older son, David called Davy, watches the hunger and humiliation around them and cannot accept his father's faith in the British system. Davy's sense of righteousness runs hot. He becomes drawn to the more radical voices in the parish, especially that of Paul Bogle, who is preaching not mere complaint but active resistance against the injustices that have never really ended since slavery. As tension mounts in Morant Bay, the colonial authorities ignore the pleas and petitions of the local population. Instead of attending to hunger and unfair taxation, officials treat the peasants like troublesome children needing firm discipline. When local protesters are arrested and beaten, the spark of rebellion is ignited. Davy joins Bogle's march towards Morant Bay Courthouse. The march, at first, is charged with a sense of moral urgency, a belief that oppressed people must stand up for themselves if justice is ever to be real. Young John watches from a distance, feeling a mixture of fear, pride, and confusion as his brother crosses a boundary that the father had always warned against. The Morant Bay Rebellion breaks out violently. Rebels, burning with resentment, clash with officials. It is a moment that seems to promise change, but quickly turns tragic. The British response is swift, merciless, and devastating. Martial law is declared. Troops sweep through communities, executing, flogging, and burning. Villages are attacked. Anyone suspected of rebellion is hunted down. The Campbell household, which had tried to remain neutral, is not spared. In the chaos, John's father is shot, despite all his attempts to preserve loyalty to Britain and separate himself from rebellion. His mother and many relatives are killed in the sweeping reprisals. For John, this shatters his childhood faith in safety and order. The world suddenly becomes a place where innocence has no protection. Davy, now a fugitive, realizes the scale of the catastrophe but refuses to surrender. He gathers John and his sweetheart, Lucille Dubois, and flees eastward. The three escape across hazardous paths, hiding from soldiers, moving at night and hoping for some corner of the island untouched by the colonial purge. Eventually, they reach a remote cay, a little island off the coast, isolated and rough, but far from the guns and gallows of Morant Bay. This escape closes the first part of the novel, leaving behind a Jamaica scorched by retaliation and haunted by the broken promise of emancipation. Part 1 ends with the wreckage of a family, the silencing of a father's faith, and the beginning of a different kind of exile, not simply from home, but from the world that John had once trusted. Part 2. Exile, Settlement, and the Cracks in the Dream. After the terror and reprisals that follow the Morant Bay Revolt, Davy, Lucille, and young John reach the cay almost by miracle. It is a thin, wine-beaten island that feels like the very edge of the world. At first the place looks bleak with its rough scrub, salt spray, and little shelter, but to Davy it promises something deeper than comfort. He tells John that here they will be free from the planners, free from the soldiers, and free from a history that has already smashed so many lives. For John, still a child, the cay becomes both a refuge from horror and a strange school in courage and survival. Davy works endlessly. He clears land, catches fish, and begins planting whatever will grow. Lucille does her part, though she carries the emotional shock of all they have witnessed. She worries about her family left behind and often stares across the open water as if listening for voices she can no longer hear. There is tenderness between her and Davy, but the tenderness sits beside a quiet unease. She knows Davy survived because he refused to surrender, and now she senses that same refusal turning into something almost rigid. As time passes, luck brings a few others who wash up or drift to the quay. Some are runaways, others are people who have simply lost their footing on the mainland. Davy welcomes them and slowly a settlement takes shape. Houses rise from timber and palm trunks. People pool labor, they hunt, fish and farm together. In these early years the settlement shines with possibility. People speak of fairness, say that work should be shared, and that no one should be looked down upon for color or background. Davy encourages this spirit and is respected as the man whose faith kept them alive. Yet as the settlement grows, Davy's ideals sharpen into rules. His sense of justice becomes absolute. He insists that the quay must avoid the old sins of Jamaica. He speaks more often in a voice that sounds like judgment rather than sympathy. When disputes arise among settlers, Davy intervenes not only as advisor, but as final authority. What began as guidance hardens into command. John, maturing through these years, notices that Davy's intensity leaves little room for disagreement. The people admire him, but they also fear crossing him. Lucille feels the weight most deeply. What she once admired in Davy now exhausts her. She longs for rest, for softness, for a life less governed by a single man's vision. Her marriage begins to look like another form of struggle. The quay, originally a haven, becomes a place where she cannot breathe freely. The love between her and Davy remains, but it is overshadowed by the shadow of his own ambition to create a perfect society. Nature eventually forces the truth upon them. A violent hurricane strikes the quay, tearing apart homes and fields. The sea roars across the land, and in that terrifying storm Davy is killed. The man who once defied colonial rule and hoped to rebuild life on new principles is suddenly gone. Lucille is shattered. She does not return easily to the settlement's routines. Her grief twists into despair, and she slips away from the life she had tried so hard to build. Her absence becomes one of the lingering pains of the book. John survives both storm and sorrow. He gradually takes responsibility for Davy and Lucille's son, John Campbell. From this moment, the narrative tone changes. The quay no longer looks like a place of rebirth. It feels instead like a reminder that noble dreams can still break under human frailty and the sheer force of the world. John remains loyal to Davy's memory, but he also learns that freedom cannot be created by a single man's will. The quay teaches him that building a just life requires patience with human weakness as much as courage against oppression. The boy who escaped massacre with his brother now becomes the quiet keeper of a new generation and the carrier of a history that is still unfinished. Part 3. Legacy, New Leaders and the Coming of a New Day. Years pass after Davy's death and the fading of the quay's early promise. John becomes almost a father to Davy and Lucille's son, John Campbell. He raises the boy with a gentle steadiness, hoping that something of Davy's fire will survive, but also knowing too well that ideals alone are not enough. The quay by now feels more like a lonely backwater than a symbol of rebirth. People drift in and out, the community never quite recovers, and life settles into survival rather than vision. John grows up respectful and capable, but he never develops his father's fierce imagination. As a young man, John eventually leaves the quay behind and seeks opportunity elsewhere. He becomes a businessman, reasonably successful, but he is not drawn to politics or large causes. His life suggests that Davy's ideals, though powerful, cannot be passed on simply by blood. More telling is his marriage to a wife whose background leans towards the British world that once oppressed the family. The union seems comfortable, but spiritually distant from the struggles that shaped Davy's rebellion. John Creary's story ends in tragedy when both he and his wife die during a smallpox outbreak, leaving behind a young son, Garth Campbell. John, by now older and wiser, steps once more into the role of guardian. He raises Garth much as he raised Garth's father, but this time something is different. Garth grows up with a sharper mind and a wider ambition. He is sent abroad for education, which places him in touch with modern ideas and new movements sweeping through the Caribbean. When he returns to Jamaica, he does not come back as a dreamer like Davy or as a cautious businessman like his father, but as a man ready to engage with the rising tide of political change. Garth becomes involved in labor organization and public affairs. He moves among ordinary people, listens to their grievances, and speaks with the confidence of someone who believes history can still be reshaped. Through him, the novel's long arc begins to bend toward national self-expression. The colonial age is weakening, new political parties are forming, and the desire for self-rule gathers strength across the island. Garth is not a perfect hero, but he stands at the moment when the struggle of peasants, rebels, and forgotten families finally begins to turn into real political momentum. The novel's framing returns us to old John Campbell on the night before Jamaica receives a new constitution in 1944. He lies awake, thinking about the 79 years between V S Rebellion and this moment when Jamaica is about to step into a different political future. He remembers the dead, the exiles, the disappointments, and the quiet endurance of ordinary people. In Garth he sees the fulfillment of what Davy died believing. The new day in the title becomes both a literal political dawn and a symbolic healing of the wounded memory of the island. For John, who has been witness, survivor, guardian, and storyteller, this moment is bittersweet. The struggles of 1865 have not vanished, but they have grown into something larger than rebellion. They have become a national voice. As he watches Garth step into leadership, John senses that Jamaica is finally beginning to claim its own story, moving out of the long shadow of colonial rule into a morning that previous generations only dared to imagine. Key events: 1. The outbreak of the Morant Bay Rebellion, 1865. This is where everything begins. Rising poverty, drought, social injustice, and the despair of poor freedmen push many towards revolt. In the story, the mood becomes explosive, and under the leadership of activists including Paul Bogle fictionally echoed, the peasants, including young Davy Campbell, march to the courthouse in Morant Bay. Violence erupts, the militia fires into the crowd, the courthouse is burned, lives are lost. This event ruptures the world John Campbell knows, destroys his family's old security, and triggers the first major shift away from colonial order. 2. The massacre, executions, and collapse of the uprising. In response to the rebellion, colonial troops, under martial law, carry out brutal reprisals across the parish, mass shootings, summary executions, floggings, wholesale destruction of homes and communities. Among those killed is John and Davy's father Pa John Campbell, many of their relatives, and countless nameless peasants. The collapse of the rebellion marks not just personal tragedy for the Campbells, but a major historical turning point. It forces survivors to flee, lays waste to peasant resistance, and signals the bloody suppression of radical hopes. In the novel, this episode shatters childhood innocence and marks exile for the protagonist. 3. The flight to and attempted building of a new community on the Cape Salt Savannah, and its eventual failure. Fleeing the devastation, Davy, his bride Lucille, and John escape to a remote Cape off the coast. There they try to build a new life, a self-governing community away from colonial reach. Davy pours himself into work and idealism. The Cape becomes a place of hope, labor, solidarity, and a kind of utopia. But over time, Davy's idealism hardens into rigidity. He becomes authoritarian, turning Zion into something almost tyrannical rather than free. The community fractures, then nature itself, a hurricane, strikes. Davy dies, Lucille vanishes into despair. The dream dissolves, This event underlines a tragic insight. Even deeply felt rebellion and noble intentions may crumble under human weakness and external forces. 4. The rise of the new generation and the dawn of constitutional change, circa 1944. Decades later, the descendants of the original rebels, especially Garth Campbell, emerge. Garth, educated abroad and then returned home as a lawyer and political organizer, becomes active in labor politics and constitutional reform. On the night before Jamaica's new constitution in 1944, the elderly narrator, John Campbell, reflects on the family's painful history, the sacrifices, the failed utopias, and the slow arc of struggle. Garth embodies the long-deferred hopes of earlier generations. This final turning point, the new day, symbolizes the possibility, long denied, of justice, self-government, and a self-created identity for Jamaica. Context and background. New Day 1949 is the first novel of the Jamaican writer Victor Stafford Reid. It grew out of a deep desire to reinterpret Jamaican history from the point of view of the ordinary black people who had lived through oppression, rebellion, and slow political change. One of the crucial historical events behind the novel is the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865. Led by Paul Bogle, this revolt came about some 30 years after emancipation and exposed how little freedom actually meant for former slaves. Poverty, punishment, high taxation, and legal injustice formed the real conditions of life, and many Jamaicans felt that the promise of emancipation had been betrayed. Reid uses this crisis as the starting gun for the narrative, so the story unfolds from the end of slavery into the long struggle for civil rights. The novel was written during the period when Jamaica was preparing for self-government. In the 1940s, political consciousness was rising, labor unions were growing, and new political parties were forming. Reid was keenly aware that a new national identity was being imagined. Instead of repeating the British-centered version of Jamaican history, he wanted to show that ordinary Jamaicans, especially those descended from enslaved Africans, were active makers of their own destiny. In that sense, the book speaks to two historical moments at once: the 19th century rebellion and the 20th century movement towards constitutional change. Another striking background feature is Reid's use of Jamaican vernacular. At the time he published the novel, most literary work from the Caribbean was still heavily shaped by Standard English. Reid openly employed nation language in narration and dialogue, which was radical partly because it challenged colonial literary expectations and partly because it validated the everyday speech of Jamaican people. This linguistic choice is not just stylistic, it is a political statement, suggesting that Jamaican voices and ways of seeing the world are fully capable of carrying history, memory, and truth. Socially, the novel comes out of a world still haunted by colonial rule, color prejudice, and class division. Reid wanted readers to grasp how colonialism did not simply end with emancipation, but rather continued through new forms of economic and social control. By following the Campbell family across generations, he shows how rebellion, exile, political organizing, and constitutional change are connected threads of the same long story. The background, therefore, is not only historical, but also ideological, because Reid uses history as evidence that Jamaica's new day was earned by the sacrifices and vision of its own people. John Campbell. John is both participant and memory keeper. The story begins with him as a child whose world is smashed by colonial repression after Morant Bay. This early trauma shapes his lifelong distrust of British authority and his quiet loyalty to the oppressed. As narrator, John speaks from old age on the eve of constitutional change, so the entire novel becomes his personal journey from frightened boy to reflective elder. He never becomes a public hero, yet he keeps the thread of history alive. His importance lies in his endurance and his ability to carry the legacy of 3 generations. John gives the novel its emotional continuity, showing how history is lived and remembered inside an ordinary Jamaican life. David Davy Campbell. Davy is the fire at the heart of Part 1 and 2. He cannot tolerate humiliation or injustice and refuses to accept his father's faith in British law. The Morant Bay Revolt gives him a cause larger than his own anger. On the Quay, he imagines a fresh beginning based on equality, but his ideals harden into authority. He loves fiercely, but commands fiercely too. His death in the storm is more than personal tragedy. It marks the collapse of the first attempt at freedom. Davy represents the painful truth that rebellion must be followed by wisdom if it is to survive. He is the emotional peak of the early narrative and the passionate ancestor of later political action. Lucille Dubois. Lucille feels the hidden wounds of rebellion, the ones not fought with weapons. Violence follows her not only in the loss of home, but in the emotional strain of Davy's relentless idealism. She wants belonging, but also tenderness. On the Quay she helps build life, but quietly suffers under a vision that allows little softness. Her disappearance after Davy's death shows how revolutionary dreams can break the lives of those who stand beside the fighters. Lucille embodies the unspoken cost of national struggle, especially for women whose grief and despair rarely enter public record. Pa John Campbell. Pa John holds onto the belief that the empire is just and the law reliable. His loyalty is not foolish. It reflects a generation that hoped emancipation would be honored. When he is killed in the reprisals, that older belief collapses dramatically, both in the family and symbolically for Jamaica. His death turns the father into a warning. He stands for the colonial dream that freedom could be received peacefully rather than fought for. His fate teaches John that obedience never guaranteed protection. John Campbell. John carries Davy's blood but not his burning spirit. Educated and business-minded, he settles into a respectable life and marries into a family closer to the colonial class. His path removes the Campbells slightly from rebellion, showing a turn toward stability rather than struggle. His early death from smallpox creates another break in the line of inheritance and reminds us that history does not move smoothly. He represents a generation caught between primitive revolt and modern politics, neither revolutionary nor passive, but quietly shaped by what came before. Garth Campbell. Garth is the great hope of the future. He receives education abroad, returns with modern ideas, and joins the rising labor and political movements shaping 20th century Jamaica. He stands at the point where rebellion becomes organized politics. Unlike Davy, he does not imagine freedom through escape or utopian community. He seeks change inside Jamaica through public action. His appearance in the final part signals the beginning of national self-consciousness and the political awakening that leads towards self-government. He is the living sign that the sacrifices of the past were not in vain. Paul Bogle. Although not central in the plot, Bogle's historical leadership is the spark that lights the novel's beginning. His moral authority and willingness to confront colonial power give Davy a model of courage. Bogle is the link between actual Jamaican history and Reid's fictional family. His presence preserves the truth that rebellion is not a decorative episode but a turning point that forced the island towards a different identity. The Jamaican vernacular. The Jamaican vernacular in New Day is one of the most distinctive elements of the novel. V S Reid allows his narrator, John Campbell, to speak in a voice that reflects the cadences and rhythms of Jamaican speech rather than the formal tone of standard English. This is not simply a stylistic choice, but a cultural and political one. Rather than retelling Jamaican history through the voice of the colonizer, Reid places the language of ordinary Jamaican people at the center of the narrative. The novel becomes a form of spoken testimony, where history sounds like it belongs to the people who lived it. Reid uses Jamaican Creole as a way of reclaiming a story that had long been reported, judged, and condemned by British authorities. The Morant Bay Rebellion, for instance, was officially recorded as criminal disorder, yet the language in the novel reveals the humanity, suffering, and hope of those involved. When characters speak in their natural voice, they are no longer figures in a colonial archive. They become thinking, feeling subjects, capable of remembering tragedy and imagining freedom. In this sense, language becomes a method of resistance. It pushes back against erasure and gives dignity to voices that history tried to silence. The vernacular also creates authenticity. The novel feels like oral storytelling, the kind that passes from older generation to younger around firesides or in family gatherings. John's voice has the tone of memory, sometimes mournful, sometimes humorous, and usually shaped by everyday speech patterns. The reader tends to feel as though an elder is narrating events directly, inviting us to listen rather than simply read. This oral quality supports the narrative structure, which shifts between past wound and future possibility, always filtered through lived experience rather than official record. Reid's use of Jamaican speech also contributes to a broader cultural project. Caribbean literature in the mid-20th century began insisting that West Indian writing must speak with its own voice. Writers like Reid believed that literature should not imitate European forms or accents, but reflect the reality of Caribbean life, identity, and history. The vernacular in New Day, therefore, becomes part of a wider movement towards cultural self-definition. It demonstrates that language has the power to carry national identity long before political independence arrives. The musical energy of the vernacular adds emotional depth to the novel. Reid incorporates proverbs, biblical rhythms, idioms, and repetitions that belong to Jamaican oral tradition. These features reveal communal wisdom and spiritual sensibility, especially in the way people understand suffering and hope. The language becomes more than communication, it becomes memory, culture, and heritage. By the closing chapters, the voice has become almost mythic, holding together the pain of the past and the promise of a new day that Jamaica longs for.